The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's Hospital in Savannah hum their endless mechanical prayer over the cardiac unit at 6 in the morning, and Margaret Walsh moves through the sterile corridors like someone who has learned to make herself smaller with each passing year. 3 years she has been here. 1,095 days of folding linens with surgical precision, checking vitals with hands that once held a dying teammate's chest cavity open under moonlight in mountains that no longer exist on any official map. The scrubs are crisp. Her movements are economical. Everything about her is designed to be invisible. She pulls fresh linens from the industrial washer, and the fabric comes away warm, smelling of institutional bleach and the particular antiseptic undertone that clings to everything in hospitals like a second skin. Her fingers fold the corners with the same attention to angle and tension she once used to fold a flag. Square. Crease. Perfect. The motion is automatic, which means her hands can move without her mind following, and her mind, after 12 years of this kind of thing, prefers to operate in the spaces between tasks where nobody is watching. The morning shift briefing happens at 6:30 in the unit conference room. Margaret sits in the back corner, coffee untouched, listening to the day's admissions and discharges. Bed for C is being prepared for a post-op cardiac patient. Bed 7A will receive a new admission sometime before noon. Standard operations. Predictable rhythms. She has learned that predictability is a gift in civilian life, that nobody asks questions when you move through your day like a ghost with a clipboard. But then Corporal Davies arrives. The ambulance bay doors open at 7:14, and the paramedics wheel him through on a stretcher, his chart already thick with operative notes and imaging reports. 24 years old. Critical blast injury sustained in the Hindu Kush region. Femoral artery repair at forward operating base shank. Transfer to Walter Reed for secondary procedures. Now here, at St. Michael's, for post-operative cardiac monitoring because the blast wave had compressed his chest cavity, and sometimes the heart forgets its rhythm when it has been shaken hard enough. Margaret helped settle him into bed for C. His eyes are pale blue and restless, moving across her face with the particular kind of alertness that belongs to people trained to read threats in the space between heartbeats. He is young. His left arm is bandaged to the shoulder. There is a surgical scar running down his sternum that speaks of thoracic trauma and people who knew exactly what they were doing in an operating theater. She checks his vitals without speaking. Blood pressure 140/88. Heart rate 86. O2 saturation 97% on supplemental oxygen. His chart notes pain management every 4 hours, and she adjusts the 4 drip with the kind of deliberate care that comes from understanding that morphine is sometimes the only language available when the body has been broken by something larger than itself. And then he speaks. "You move like you've been trained," he says. Not a question. An observation, the way a soldier might comment on the angle of a rifle or the weight distribution in a combat stance. Margaret does not pause. Her hands remain steady on the fall line. "Hospital protocols," she says. Her voice is even. Quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from practice. 20 years of practice makes it automatic. But she does not tell him she has been trained in field medicine under fire. She does not tell him about the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment or the medevac operation she ran in the mountains where he now has a scar. She does not tell him anything that matters. Instead, she makes a note in his chart and steps back from the bed, and his eyes follow her with that same tactical recognition, the way a dog recognizes another dog, regardless of what collar it might be wearing. Margaret moves through the rest of the morning with the same measured efficiency. She checks on patients in beds 3A and 5F. She documents vital signs. She refills medication cups. She exists in the liminal space between nursing competence and complete invisibility, which is exactly where she has learned to live. It is during the midday supply inventory that she finds herself alone in a locker room, and her hand moves almost without volition to the small shadow box tucked behind her spare scrubs on the highest shelf. The flag is carefully folded into a tight triangle, the way flags are folded at military funerals. Red and blue and white. The fabric is older than it should be for something this new, worn soft from handling, and the creases are so precise they could cut glass. Sergeant Elena Vasquez. Call sign Valkyrie 5. Died holding a tourniquet while Margaret performed an emergency field thoracotomy with a combat knife in a village that was not on any map and under an order that came with the explicit instruction, "You were never there, and if you surface, we cannot protect you." That was 12 years ago. The flag stayed. The name became Margaret Walsh. The surgical precision became the invisible competence of a middle-aged cardiac nurse in a hospital in Savannah, where nobody asks questions and nobody wants to know anything more than what appears on a chart. Her fingers touch the fabric for exactly 3 seconds. Then the moment is gone, and she closes the locker and returns to the unit. Dr. Pierce arrives at 1 in the afternoon, his expensive shoes clicking against the tile floor like a countdown timer. He moves through the unit with the particular confidence of someone who has never learned that confidence built on nothing is visible to anyone who knows where to look. His shoes are Italian leather. His watch is a Rolex. His white coat is pristine, untouched by the actual work of medicine, which suggests he spends most of his time in conference rooms and committee meetings and in places where the real bleeding has already been cleaned up by nurses who are trained not to stain things. He pauses at bed for C, where Davies is sleeping, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of post-operative rest. Pierce reads the chart. His eyes scan. His mind catalogues. And when his gaze finally moves across the room and settles on Margaret folding linens near the supply station, she sees the moment he decides what he is looking at. Just a nurse. Middle-aged. Age spots on her hands from too many years of exposure and too little sunlight. The kind of woman who has become part of the institutional furniture, so familiar nobody bothers to see her anymore. The kind of woman whose hands have become competent through sheer repetition rather than through any particular talent or training. Visible only as a function, like the machines around her. He does not see the way her fingers fold linens with the same precision surgeons use in operating theaters. He does not see the tactical awareness in her movements, the way her eyes track the entire unit without her head moving, the way she positions herself to have clear sight lines to every bed and every exit. He does not see the surgical knowledge embedded in every gesture, the understanding of trauma and pressure and the way human bodies fail under certain kinds of stress. What he sees is inefficiency waiting to be corrected. What he sees is a liability. What he sees, Margaret understands with the absolute clarity that comes from decades of training, is a problem that he has already begun solving in his mind. She watches him make a note on his phone. One note. Probably nothing. Probably just a reminder to order supplies or call a pharmaceutical representative. Probably nothing at all. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the way Corporal Davies, still half asleep in bed for C, turned his head and watched Dr. Pierce write that note, and then turned his head back to watch Margaret, and in his pale blue operator's eyes was the absolute unmistakable recognition of someone who has been trained to identify military personnel regardless of their current uniform, and Margaret felt something in her chest tighten like the moment before a helicopter loses altitude. Davies knew. Or he was beginning to know. Or some part of his tactical training had flagged something in the way she moved and the way she breathed and the way she existed in space that did not match a civilian hospital nurse named Margaret Walsh, and the Pentagon's longest-standing instruction echoed in her mind with the force of a physical blow: "You were never there, and if you surface, we cannot protect you." She finished folding the linens. Her hands did not shake. Her breathing did not change. She moved through the rest of the day with the same invisible competence, and when her shift ended at 7 in the evening, she clocked out and walked to the parking lot under a sky that was beginning to darken, unaware that everything she had built in 12 years of careful anonymity was already collapsing, and that within 72 hours, the sky above Savannah would be filled with the sound of helicopter rotors and voices shouting her name, the name she had buried so carefully that she had almost convinced herself it belonged to someone else. The room in 447 smelled like antiseptic and expensive cologne, Pierce's cologne, the kind that announced itself before he did. Margaret was checking the 4 line when she heard his voice rise above the monitor beeps, loud enough for the family gathered around Corporal Davies's bed to stop mid-conversation and turn. "Nurse Walsh. I need to discuss your narcotic count from yesterday." "Not a question. A performance. Can you explain the discrepancy, or is your memory failing along with your attention to detail? She didn't flinch. Her hands remained exactly where they were, steady on the four-pump, fingers adjusting the flow rate with the precision of someone who had once threaded a needle in a blackout tent under fire. The machines hummed their mechanical rhythm around her. Monitors. Ventilator. The soft wheeze of compressed air through tubing. Davies's mother stared at Pierce, then at Margaret, her face flushing with second-hand embarrassment. Margaret turned to face him. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, just the faintest muscle contraction along her mandible, invisible to anyone not trained to read the language of barely contained composure. She had been reading this language for 12 years. It was the language she spoke in the silence of her apartment at 3 in the morning, when she pressed her palm against the scar tissue on her left shoulder and remembered the field hospital in Loga province, the smell of diesel and blood and inadequate anesthesia. "The count was accurate, doctor," she said. 8 words. Measured. Even. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who had learned that every word was a liability. "At your age, Margaret, these little mistakes add up." He smiled. The smile of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Perhaps it's time to consider less demanding work. Less critical responsibilities. The family watched. Davies watched, his eyes tracking her with the peculiar alertness of someone who recognized something in the way she stood, the way her shoulders didn't curl inward despite the weight of his condescension settling on her like snow. She initiated the incident report without a word. Her signature was steady, the letters precise as a military hand receipt for classified equipment. Margaret Walsh, RN. The signature of a woman who had never existed, signed in the presence of a man who had no idea she was standing in his hospital at all. When she returned to Davies's bedside, she adjusted his morphine infusion with movements so economical they bordered on invisible. Pierce lingered in the doorway for another 30 seconds, waiting, she understood, for her to break. To crumble. To give him the satisfaction of seeing the impact of his words register somewhere in her face. She didn't give him anything. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, the break room smelled like burnt coffee and the chemical ghost of industrial cleaner. Margaret pushed through the double doors with her lunch, a plastic container of chicken and brown rice, the kind of meal designed to be consumed without thought, fuel rather than food. The break room was occupied. For nurses clustered around the microwave, laughing about something on someone's phone. She sat at the corner table. Alone. The microwave beeped. The 4 nurses, Susan, Keisha, and 2 travelers whose names she had never quite learned, gathered their food and left. Not rushed. Not obvious. But organized, like a practiced choreography. They filed past her table, and she heard it, the whisper that trailed behind Keisha like perfume. Erratic behavior, someone murmured. Concerning judgment calls, another voice confirmed. Margaret's hands whitened around her fork. Not trembling. Not shaking. Just pressing, the way a gunner's hands pressed into the trigger guard on a 240 Bravo during an 18-hour mounted patrol. Pressure. Control. The illusion of stillness masking something far more dangerous underneath. She ate her lunch. She ate every single bite while sitting alone in a break room that hummed with the fluorescent lights overhead, their electric droner sound so constant you stopped hearing it, the way soldiers stopped hearing the sound of their own breathing inside a breaching helmet. The sound was always there. You just learned to move through it. By the 3rd day, Pierce had moved past innuendo into institutional violence. The unit board at the nurses' station displayed the written warning like a public execution notice. Margaret read it twice, her eyes cataloguing the dates, the fabricated medication errors, the careful grammatical perfection of his accusations. This was the work of a man who had prepared for this moment, who had been building his case with the methodical precision of a prosecutor constructing charges against someone he had already decided was guilty. "Everyone needs to initial Walsh's corrective action plan," Pierce announced, his voice carrying across the station with the satisfied tone of a man who had just closed a trap. "Patient safety is paramount, and we need accountability at every level." Someone laughed. A single nurse, One of the travelers caught Margaret's eye with something like sympathy, then looked away. Margaret approached the board. She read the document again, this time carefully, the way a combat medic reads vitals on a patient who is about to die. Every detail mattered. Every comma was a betrayal. Pierce had documented that she had miscounted narcotics on 3 separate occasions. He had cited her for unauthorized medication administration. He had quoted her, falsely, as having said things she had never said. It was brilliant. It was thorough. It was exactly what you did when you wanted to build a case that would survive legal scrutiny. She signed her name. Margaret Walsh, RN. Date, current date. When she finished, she turned to face the unit. 37 people worked on this floor. 17 were present at this moment. 16 avoided her eyes. 1, a resident named Chen who was rotating through cardiology, held her gaze for exactly 1 second longer than was comfortable, his expression unreadable. Margaret turned and walked back to room for 47. Corporal Davies was resting, his monitors showing the green steady lines of a patient whose body was healing even if his circumstances were not. She checked his vitals, pulse 78, regular and strong. Blood pressure stable. O2 sat climbing slightly. His surgical site was clean, the sutures intact, the drainage minimal. Good. Everything about his physiology suggested recovery. Everything about his placement in this hospital, under this doctor, in a building that was beginning to close ranks against the woman who had admitted him, suggested something else entirely. She noticed the billing discrepancies while updating his chart. 3 procedures listed in his insurance claim that she had not witnessed. A cardiac catheterization. An echocardiogram. A stress test. All coded and dated, all generating payment from his TRICARE benefits, all never performed in her presence or, as far as she could determine, by anyone on this unit. She photographed the screen with her phone. 1 image. 2. 3. Clinical documentation of fraud, captured in the fluorescent light that hummed overhead with the indifference of machinery that had seen 1,000 small betrayals. She deleted the photos. Then she restored them from the trash folder, because the part of her that had been trained for 12 years in the mountains of Kuna province understood that you never destroyed evidence of institutional corruption, you documented it. You recorded it. You kept it separate from your personal survival and waited for the moment when documentation might matter. When her shift ended at 7, the sky over Savannah was the color of wet concrete. Rain had moved in from the coast. The parking lot glistened with that peculiar sheen that comes before a storm, when the humidity is so thick you can taste electricity in the air. She walked to her car. She drove home through traffic that moved like blood through aging arteries, slow, persistent, inevitable. And by the time she had parked in her apartment complex, changed out of her scrubs, and stood in the shower with water running down her shoulders, she understood something with the clarity of a combat assessment. Dr. Pierce had made his choice. The written warning was the escalation. The rumors were the preparation. And whatever came next, whatever he had planned, whatever he was building toward, had already begun its inevitable trajectory toward collision. She pressed her palm against the shower wall and felt the old scar tissue on her shoulder begin to ache. Not from pain. Pain was information. This was something else. This was the body's memory of a moment in the Hindu Kush when everything had changed in the span of 7 seconds, when her team had moved from tactical superiority to active evacuation in the time it took for a rocket-propelled grenade to rewrite the geography of a compound wall. The water ran hot. Steam rose around her like a ghost she couldn't quite remember the name of. The routine dressing change began like all the others. Margaret wheeled the supplies into Davies's room at 6:02 a.m., before the shift chaos erupted, before the day nurses arrived with their gossip and their careful distance. The morning light through the windows was that pale Savannah grey, the kind that made everything look like it was underwater. Davies was awake, propped on his left side, his chest still wrapped in the surgical dressing from the initial debridement. She'd changed this wound 17 times. She knew its language. The moment she peeled back the outer gauze, she knew. The smell hit first, not the clean antiseptic she expected, but something else underneath. Copper and decay. Biofilm. The dressing was warm to her touch, warmer than it should be at this stage. She didn't pause. Didn't call for backup. Her fingers moved with the precision of someone who'd read 1,000 wounds in 1,000 places, including 6 in the Hindu Kush where the air itself seemed to carry infection on the wind. The surgical site was red, angry, weeping a cloudy fluid that wasn't serous drainage. It was pus. The infection had bloomed beneath the closure, pressure building behind the sutured line like a thunderstorm behind mountains. "How long has it felt warm?" she asked. Her voice was level. Professional. The kind of voice that doesn't startle patients. Davies's jaw tightened. "Since yesterday, maybe." Didn't want to say anything. "You've got enough." Pain level. Not negotiable. Not a question. A command. 7. Maybe 8 when I move. He was watching her face, reading her the way soldiers read terrain. "That's bad, isn't it?" She was already moving, already calling for the crash cart to be stationed nearby, telling the charge nurse they might need surgical on standby. Her hand smoothed fresh dressings across the site with mechanical precision, buying time while her mind calculated the bacterial load, the rate of systemic spread, the window before septic shock would start dropping his blood pressure like a stone down a well. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest like he was a fever-made human. At 7:23 a.m., during the vitals check, Davies's oxygen saturation began its fall. 98, 96, 94, he started complaining of chest tightness, his breathing shallow, the kind of breathing that meant the infection had crossed the threshold from localized to systemic. His heart rate spiked to 124. Margaret was already moving toward the call button when she saw him wince, saw his hand grab at his left side, saw the compression in his face that meant something inside him had just torn. The sutured line ruptured. She knew the exact moment it happened because she'd seen it before, had felt the arterial bleed beneath her hands in a combat surgical tent in Logar Province, a Marine with shrapnel in his chest cavity and maybe 40 seconds before the blood loss would make him unrecoverable. The alarm on the monitor screamed. O2 sat dropped to 88. His breath came in gasps. Blood began seeping through the dressing, fast enough that she could see the saturation spreading in real time. "Code blue, cardiac unit," the charge nurse said, her voice steady through the intercom. "I need the crash cart here now." Margaret didn't wait. Waiting was the choice of people who still believed protocol mattered more than breath. She moved to the supply station and grabbed the sterile scalpel kit, the one reserved for emergency procedures, the one with the surgical blade already in its wrapper. Her fingers were ice. Her mind was iron. She'd done this before with a combat knife and a flashlight, and the sound of RPG fire in the distance, had felt the ribs give way and made the decision to keep a 21-year-old alive by any means necessary, and 12 years of scrubs and composure and careful invisibility hadn't changed the fact that her hands remembered. She came back to the bedside and looked at Davies. 1 second. That's all it took. He nodded. Not a request. Not a question. Just recognition between two people who understood what came next. "I need you to turn on your right side. As far as you can go. Hold that position." Her voice had changed. It was the voice that had commanded a medevac team in the Hindu Kush, the voice that didn't ask for permission because it had the kind of authority that came from watching people die and refusing to add one more name to the list. She swabbed the left side of his chest with betadine from the crash cart, found the space between his 5th and 6th ribs at the mid-axillary line. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they always did, indifferent to everything. "What are you doing?" the charge nurse said, coming through the door with the crash cart. "Getting him oxygenated." Margaret didn't look up. Her hands moved like they were operating on their own, like the 12 years of playing a different role had been paused and the real program was running underneath. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping, that specific, terrifying sound of a pneumothorax decompressing, of pressure releasing, of the delta between death and the next breath collapsing into nothing. O2 sat climbing. 88 to 92. Get me a 36 French chest tube and a thoracostomy kit. Now. The charge nurse froze for exactly half a second, then moved. That's what happens when you give orders with the kind of certainty that comes from having actually done them before. But Margaret wasn't done. The small procedure wasn't enough. She could feel the infection in his chest cavity, could sense it like sonar, and she made the calculation in the time it takes to breathe once. The infection had spread to the pericardium. His heart was filling with fluid. The external drainage wasn't going to save him. She needed to open his chest. Get me a thoracotomy kit. Left anterolateral incision, and I need 500 milliliters of warm saline and a satin sky clamp. Move. She was already swabbing his chest again, mapping the incision site with the precision of someone who'd done this in a dusty surgical tent under the kind of stress that would have broken most people. The scalpel felt like home in her hand. She made the cut, a clean line from the fourth intercostal space down through the ribs, and the blood came, not from the incision but from the infection that had eaten through the tissue beneath. She didn't flinch. Didn't hesitate. Just worked with the economy of motion that came from having exactly 40 seconds before Davies's heart would stop beating. The next voice through the door was Dr. Pierce. His face went through 7 emotions in the 3 seconds before he started screaming. Red. Then whiter than paper. What are you doing? His voice came out strangled, like something caught in his throat. Stop. Stop immediately. You're not authorized. You're a nurse. You don't perform thoracotomies. Step away from that patient right now. Margaret's hands didn't stop. Didn't even slow. She was working with a Reboa balloon catheter, managing the hemorrhage from the chest cavity, getting Davies oxygenated and perfused while his heart was literally exposed to the air. The surgical team was 12 minutes out at best. Davies had maybe 3. You are actively violating patient safety protocols. Pierce's voice was getting louder, more panicked. This is gross negligence. You have no physician oversight. You're going to kill him. Step away from the patient. The intercom crackled. Surgical team ETA for minutes. Margaret was already past hearing Pierce. She was in the place where captains lived, where decisions had weight and consequence, where every motion had to be perfect because the alternative was watching someone die on a table because of protocol. She worked in silence, in focus, in the kind of competence that made Pierce's screaming sound like a child's tantrum in a distant room. The thoracic surgeon came through the doors at a sprint, took in the scene in less than a second, and didn't say a word. Just slid into position beside Margaret like they were a choreographed unit. The handoff was seamless. Margaret stepped back as the surgical team moved in, but not before the surgeon looked at her and nodded. Not a word. Just acknowledgement. Davies's eyes found hers as they wheeled him toward the OR. Still conscious. Still alive. His lips moved. She read them without hearing, Valkyrie. She didn't respond. Just watched them take him away, watched the blood drip from her gloved hands onto the tile floor, watched the fluorescent lights hum their indifferent song. Dr. Pierce was standing in the doorway of the administrative offices when she came out of the patient room. He wasn't alone. 2 security guards flanked him, along with the HR director, a woman named Chen who always smiled like she meant it but who had just been handed a manila folder thick as a phone book. Margaret could see the tabs already labeled. Already organized. Already prepared. Margaret Walsh. The HR director's voice was professional. Sad, even. Which was somehow worse. Yes. We need you to come with us. Your employment status requires immediate review. She turned to follow them. Her scrubs were stained with blood. Her hands were shaking now, but not from fear. From the crash of adrenaline meeting stillness, from the reversal of everything. 12 years of being invisible had just exploded into the brightest possible light, and the machinery that had been wound up against her was finally releasing. Dr. Pierce stepped into her path as she walked past. His voice dropped to a whisper that only she could hear. You think you can override a physician? You think protocol doesn't apply to you? I've been documenting your instability for weeks. Medication errors. Behavioral concerns. Incompetence. That thoracotomy was the capstone. Unauthorized surgical procedure. No physician oversight. Catastrophic breach of scope of practice. You're done here, Margaret. You're finished. She stopped. Looked at him. Her voice came out perfectly level, perfectly calm, the voice of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by maintaining composure. He's alive because I moved. You can document whatever you want. The question is what the surveillance camera documented. The one in the corner that's been recording this entire floor since 2015. His face drained of color. She walked past him toward the HR offices, and as she did, she could hear the administrative machines beginning their work, the filing of incident reports, the affidavit of witnesses he'd carefully coached, the written termination notice that would be waiting for her in a few hours, signed and dated before she'd even finished saving a patient's life. But that wasn't the worst part. She scrubbed out slowly, watching the blood and saline run brown down the stainless steel sink. Her hands moved through the motions with the same mechanical precision they'd learned in the field. Step 1, Step 2, no wasted motion. The thoracotomy had held. Davies's heart was beating in rhythm, his lungs inflating on their own, his blood pressure climbing back toward something survivable. She'd known it would work the moment she made the incision. Muscle memory doesn't forget. She dried her hands on a paper towel and turned toward the corridor. Dr. Pierce was waiting. 2 security guards flanked him, their posture suggesting they'd been briefed on the possibility of resistance. Behind them stood the HR director, a woman named Catherine Moss who'd processed Margaret's hire 3 years ago with a smile that now felt like a different era. In Pierce's hands was a manila folder, thick as a medical chart, its edges already dog-eared from handling. Captain's office, Pierce said, and the word captain came out like an insult, though he couldn't possibly know what it meant. Margaret didn't acknowledge him. She walked past, and the security guard stepped into position behind her, a formation she recognized from checkpoint protocol she'd thought she'd left behind in the Hindu Kush. The hallway tiles reflected the overhead lights in a blur of white and gray. Her scrubs were still damp with Davies's blood. The conference room on the 3rd floor was windowless, fluorescent lit, the kind of space designed to make time feel negotiable. Catherine Moss sat at the head of the table. Dr. Pierce stood at the opposite end, arms crossed, his face flushed with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd finally closed his trap. The security guards positioned themselves at the door, not threatening, exactly, but present enough that leaving wasn't an implicit option. Margaret, Catherine began, and her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd done this before and would do it again. We've received multiple incident reports regarding your conduct on the cardiac unit. We've reviewed them with our legal counsel, and the hospital has made a decision. Pierce opened the folder and began sliding documents across the table, one by one, each one dated and signed. Medication count discrepancy, July 14, disruptive behavior, documented by Nurse Henderson. Insubordination during rounds, witnessed by 3 RNs performing an unauthorized surgical procedure without physician supervision, without credentials, his voice rose slightly. Without any authority whatsoever. Margaret watched the pages accumulate in front of her. She recognized the handwriting on several witness statements. Nurses who'd avoided her in the break room. Charts with her initials, altered to suggest negligence. The medication count from last month, she'd reported it as correct, but here was Henderson's statement claiming Margaret had insisted on recounting because she couldn't remember the original numbers. This is a pattern, Pierce continued, his words coming faster now, as though he'd been holding them for weeks and couldn't wait to release them. A concerning pattern of increasingly erratic judgment. We have a duty to our patients. To our institution. That duty requires us to take immediate action. Catherine slid a termination notice across the table. Margaret's name at the top, printed in Arial font, clinical as an autopsy report. Effective immediately. Cause, violation of patient safety protocols, unauthorized medical procedures, failure to follow chain of command, repeated policy violations. "You'll sign here," Catherine said quietly, pointing to 3 blank spaces. "And here. Initial here, confirming you've been given this document and understand the terms." Margaret's jaw tightened. Once. A single muscular contraction that lasted maybe half a second before control reasserted itself. She picked up the pen Catherine had already positioned on the table, a plastic bic, the kind hospitals bought in bulk, and read through the document. The language was precise, institutional, buttressed with policy citations that made the termination feel not like a choice but like a law of physics. Clause 4.2.1 regarding unauthorized procedures. Clause 3.5 regarding insubordination. Clause 7.1 regarding patient safety and scope of practice. Each clause pointed to her. Each one was designed to make her look like a liability. She signed all 3 pages. Her signature was steady, the letters perfectly formed, the kind of signature a person uses when they are not trembling. When they've seen worse. When they know that signing documents under duress is just another form of waiting. "Your badge," Pierce said. "Your access codes are being deactivated as of right now. You'll need to return all hospital property." Margaret unclipped her ID from her scrub pocket. The photo on it was 3 years old, showing a woman with brown hair pulled back tight, dark eyes, a slight frown. The photo looked nothing like anyone Margaret Walsh had ever been. That was the point. That had always been the point. She placed the badge on the table in front of Pierce. "The locker in the staff area," Catherine said. "Collect your personal belongings and leave through the staff entrance. You'll need to be escorted." One of the security guards, a man with the build of someone who'd lifted weights in a very deliberate way, opened the conference room door. His eye stayed on the wall behind Margaret, the professional gaze of someone trained not to see. The locker room smelled like antiseptic and industrial detergent. Margaret's locker was on the 3rd row, next to a photo of someone's grandchildren and a motivational poster about teamwork. She opened it without rushing. A change of clothes. A pair of shoes. A book she'd started 2 months ago and never finished. And the folded flag. It was smaller than most people would expect. Cotton, faded to the color of old blood. She'd folded it herself in a room in Kandahar 12 years ago, after they'd zipped Warrant Officer Halloway into a body bag and there was nothing left to do but fold the flag he'd carried through 3 tours. She kept it in her locker because the alternative, keeping it nowhere, losing it to time, was unacceptable. She placed everything in a canvas bag. The security guard watched from a distance, his job to ensure she didn't pocket any narcotics or steal any patient files. The hospital laundry facility was 1 floor down, past the cafeteria and through a corridor where the smell changed from antiseptic to industrial bleach. The industrial washers hummed their mechanical rhythm, and the dryers rumbled with the sound of moisture extraction. Margaret had been here before, always at night, always alone, always just collecting fresh scrubs. Now she folded them. Her hands moved with the precision that had kept her alive in the mountains, each crease sharp, each fold deliberate. Top left corner to center. Top right corner to center. The fabric still smelled like the hospital's generic laundry soap, sterile and uniform. She folded 3 pairs, stacked them on the sorting table, creased each edge with care as though they mattered, as though any of this mattered. The overhead lights buzzed like insects dying. A laundry worker passed through, glanced at her, looked away. She placed her ID badge on top of the folded scrubs. The photo badge with the woman who'd learned 3 years ago how to become invisible. How to be competent without being remarkable. How to save lives without drawing attention. The woman who'd folded a flag in a war zone and carried it home in her locker like a secret. The fluorescent lights flickered. Off for a microsecond. Then back on. Margaret picked up the folded flag, tucked it under her arm, and walked toward the staff exit. The evening light was fading over Savannah, the sky turning that particular shade of orange that comes just before full dark. The oak trees along the sidewalk were beginning to blur with shadow. She walked the 3 blocks toward the bus stop with the same stride she'd maintained through hostile territory, not fast, not slow, just forward. Behind her, St. Michael's Hospital continued its evening shift. Monitors beeped. For pumps hummed. The next patient was probably already in the bed where Corporal Davies had been 3 hours earlier, already hooked to machines that kept track of his heart. The next crisis was probably already forming in someone's chest, a clot or an arrhythmia or an infection that would need attention soon. The next nurse would handle it, follow the protocols, stay within the scope of practice, sign the documents they were told to sign. Margaret walked. Her footsteps were steady. Her face was composed. She was a woman walking home from work, carrying a flag that nobody would understand, toward a bus stop 3 blocks away, where the evening was turning dark and nobody was watching. The rotors came first. A sound like the sky breaking open, 5 Black Hawk helicopters dropping fast over the Savannah Historic District, their blades hammering the evening air into submission. Margaret was 3 blocks from St. Michael's, walking toward the bus stop on Victory Drive, her scrub still damp from the laundry facility, when the first helicopter's loudspeaker crackled and split the city open. Locate Captain Walsh, Priority Alpha. She stopped walking. The street around her froze. An elderly couple on their porch turned to stare. A delivery driver killed his engine. The helicopters descended in formation, military precision, practiced and inevitable, and the wind they pushed down scattered papers and leaves across the sidewalk like confetti after a funeral. Margaret stood motionless, her hands at her sides, watching the lead aircraft bank toward Memorial Park, its spotlight sweeping the dark like a searchlight cutting through fog. Her jaw tightened. Once. That was all. The first Black Hawk touched down on the park grass, rotors still spinning, and tactical teams moved with the fluid precision of apex predators, boots on wet ground, weapons held low, faces hidden behind helmet visors and the glare of their work lights. But Margaret wasn't watching the soldiers. She was watching the figure emerging from the helicopter's open door, still moving with one hand steadying an 4-pole, hospital gown flapping like a flag of surrender against the rotor wash. Corporal Davies. Still bandaged. Still bleeding through gauze on his sutured chest, the wound Margaret had opened and saved. He saw her. His eyes locked on hers across the darkening street, and his voice came out like something breaking, cracked and raw and filled with recognition. Valkyrie 6. You're Valkyrie 6. The words hung in the evening air. Nobody moved. A Marine colonel in dress blue stepped down from the helicopter, manila folder in hand, and walked toward Margaret with the bearing of a man who had spent 30 years delivering messages that changed lives. Behind him came a general, 2 stars on his shoulder boards, decorations on his chest that caught the helicopter's floodlights. The colonel reached Margaret first, opened the folder, and began reading in a voice steady as a metronome. Captain Margaret Walsh, United States Army Special Forces, for 17 lives saved under hostile fire in support of Operation Enduring Freedom, Paktia Province, 2011 through 2013. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Recommendation for Navy Cross, declassified retroactively upon Pentagon review. The citation went on, names, dates, location scrubbed from existence officially but recorded somewhere in the classified folders that the Pentagon kept in rooms without windows. Margaret listened without expression. Her hands remained steady. Her breathing never changed. Then Dr. Pierce pushed through the gathering crowd, his face red and wet, his voice climbing toward something that wasn't quite human anymore. This is inappropriate. She was terminated for gross negligence. This employee is no longer. The 2-star general stepped forward. He was older than Pierce by a decade, with scars on his neck that told their own story and eyes that had watched people die in desert heat and mountains no civilian would ever see. He looked at Pierce the way a person looks at something they've already decided doesn't exist, then turned to Margaret and saluted, a clean, precise movement, his hand rising to his brow with the kind of respect reserved for the ones who'd already paid in blood. Captain Walsh, he said, and his voice was the sound of something final. Your classified clearance was flagged during a routine Joint Commission security audit this afternoon. Pentagon Intelligence has reactivated your file. We need to talk about what comes next. The silence that followed was so thick you could operate in it. But it didn't last. Because somewhere in that crowd, pressed between a woman in a yellow coat and a man filming everything on his phone, Davies's family had been recording. His mother, his sister, they'd had their cameras up the entire time, capturing every word of the citation, every frame of Dr. Pierce sputtering like a machine with stripped gears, every second of the general salute. And within 2 hours, before the helicopters had even landed at Fort Stewart, the footage had gone live on social media with the hashtag #SavedMyBrother, 6 million views by midnight, trending above the news about wars and politics and all the usual machinery of the world. The video was relentless. It cut from Pierce's red face to his voice on a loop, a specific phrase that he'd used in Davies's hospital room when Margaret was checking his central line: "Your grandmother here thinks she understands emergency medicine. Your actual doctor will take it from here." The comments came in like artillery. "He's talking to a war hero like that, / this nurse saved a soldier's life, / did he call her grandmother, / someone get her medical board involved, / she just performed an emergency thoracotomy. What's he done, / this is a decorated officer. This is assault." News stations picked it up. By 11 p.m., CNN had a segment running with a ticker at the bottom: "Doctor under investigation for conduct toward nurse in viral video." By midnight, St. Michael's Hospital released a statement through their communications office. "St. Michael's is conducting a full investigation into personnel matters and recent allegations regarding billing procedures and potential violations of our code of conduct. All personnel involved are cooperating fully." But cooperation wasn't going to save Dr. Pierce. By 1 a.m., Dr. Harlan Voss, a Navy surgeon with 30 years of service and a reputation forged in operating tents from Baghdad to Kandahar, released a statement through his university email that was copied within hours to every medical journal and news outlet in the country. "I am ashamed to have trained the physician in these videos. His conduct violates every principle of medicine and human decency. I am formally requesting the Georgia Medical Board investigate St. Michael's Hospital's billing practices and Dr. Pierce's documented role in what appears to be systematic fraud. Captain Walsh served her country with honor. She deserves better than this." The Georgia Medical Board opened an inquiry the next morning at 7 a.m. Auditors arrived at St. Michael's by 10 a.m. with subpoenas and rubber gloves and the particular gravity of people who'd been authorized to pull everything. They found the phantom procedures Margaret had documented, 17 of them, coded to insurance companies and Medicare, phantom surgeries that generated nearly $340,000 in fraudulent billing, all routed through a shell company registered to an address in Pierce's name. They found the inflated diagnostic codes. They found the patterns. By noon, 3 other nurses came forward, 2 who'd worked nights, 1 who'd transferred to another hospital 8 months ago, each with stories matching a specific architecture: intimidation, forced signatures on incident reports they hadn't written, documentation of patient incidents that never happened, all building a case that would remove whoever questioned the billing system. Pierce's hospital credentials were suspended pending review by 2 p.m. His office was sealed with yellow tape and a police notice by 3 p.m. By 6 p.m., his wife had filed for separation through an attorney in Atlanta. By 8 p.m., his medical school colleagues had started quietly withdrawing from professional associations where they'd previously sponsored him. The traction was mathematical and absolute. The more people looked, the more they found. Not just the fraud, though that was enough, but the pattern of retaliation, the fabricated complaints, the way he'd assembled a file on Margaret like a prosecutor building a case against a criminal, except the criminal was just a nurse who'd noticed discrepancies and saved a patient's life. The Georgia Medical Board suspended his medical license on a Friday morning. The suspension notice cited pattern of unethical conduct, potential fraud, documented retaliation against reporting personnel, and endangerment of patients through documented falsification of medical records. Margaret learned about it from a phone call from hospital administration asking her to come in for a meeting. She was standing in St. Michael's boardroom the next morning, Saturday 8 a.m., when the administrator, the board chair, and the hospital's legal counsel sat across from her. Her folded flag was there too, the one she'd carried out of the hospital 2 days ago, the one she'd kept folded in her locker since 2013. It was displayed now in a shadow box on the administrator's desk, placed there as a gesture nobody needed to explain. The administrator was a woman named Chen, grey-haired and precise, with hands that had probably never done anything medically useful but carried authority like a weapon. Captain Walsh, we owe you an apology. Multiple apologies. An investigation has revealed systematic fraud, documented retaliation, and a fabricated personnel file. Dr. Pierce's medical license has been suspended. The hospital is offering you the position of Director of Emergency Services, effective immediately. Full authority over your department, salary increase to $189,000 annually, your choice of staff, and a public statement of support from this board. Margaret listened without expression. They mentioned a press conference, a ceremony, a plaque in the lobby. They mentioned an increased budget for the ER and a commitment to whistleblower protection going forward. She looked past them, through the window, toward the mountain she'd been staring at for 12 years while she folded scrubs and checked vitals and kept her hands steady, because if her hands weren't steady, people died. The mountain she'd never really left. The mountains where she'd walked through hostile fire with a medic named Torres and held him while his blood ran red on her sleeves in a place nobody was supposed to know existed. "I'll take the position," Margaret said. Her voice had changed, dropped an octave, lost every trace of deference. "One condition. Any nurse on my staff who reports a problem is believed first, investigated fairly, and never punished for speaking up. I want that in writing. And I want a review board of medical staff, nursing leadership, and 2 people from outside the hospital. Independents. People who won't protect the doctors." Chen nodded before Margaret finished speaking. They agreed. They would have agreed to almost anything. Margaret accepted with a single nod and watched them relax, watched them think they'd fixed something. She'd fixed something too. She'd just fixed it differently than they understood. Corporal Davies left for Walter Reed 2 weeks later. Before he walked out of the hospital, he found Margaret in the hallway outside the cardiac unit, and he saluted her, a clean military movement, his hand rising to his forehead with the precision of someone who'd been taught that respect isn't something you give casually. "Thank you, Captain," he said, and then he was gone, back to a surgical ward where they'd finish rebuilding him, where the scar from her emergency thoracotomy would fade to white in the Chesapeake sun. Margaret's first act as Director of Emergency Services was to implement a whistleblower protection policy and an audit review board with independent oversight. Her second was to walk to the laundry facility and find the man who'd been there when she folded her scrubs for the last time, the one who'd watched her hands move with perfect precision while her career ended. She thanked him. She told him, "If you ever see something wrong here, anything at all, you come to me directly. No one will ever retaliate. Not on my watch." He cried. It was a small, unexpected thing, but it happened. 2 months later, security footage captured Dr. Pierce loading boxes into the back of a medical supply van, the kind that makes deliveries to rural clinics and nursing homes, the kind that smells like cardboard and plastic tubing. His expensive car had been repossessed. His hands that once signed termination orders were now hauling catheters and 4 bags. The medical school had quietly removed his name from their alumni directory. His wife's lawyer had stopped returning his calls because the separation had been finalized. At the hospital's rededication ceremony, where they presented Margaret with a service award and unveiled a plaque in the lobby, Margaret stood at the podium with her folded flag displayed behind her in its shadow box, catching the light like something sacred. The crowd filled the auditorium, nurses and doctors and administrators and families who'd come because they'd heard the story, or they'd seen the video, or they just wanted to be near something that had finally made sense in a broken system. Margaret spoke, "True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Not when the cameras are rolling. Not when the helicopters land. It's what you do in the break room when someone's being harassed. It's what you do when you see something wrong and you speak up, even when it costs you everything." The rotors have gone silent, but Valkyrie 6 never stopped flying. The applause came like thunder. But Margaret was already thinking about her next shift, her next patient, her next opportunity to stand between the broken and the system that would break them further. She'd spent 12 years learning to be invisible. She'd spend the rest of her career making sure nobody else had to be. If you've made it this far, Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were really standing next to?